Theo Manning hadn't spoken to another soul in 6 weeks. That's precisely how he preferred it, tucked away in his timber cabin on the outskirts of the Cascade Mountains, where the nearest neighbor was 12 miles downhill, and the town was a forgotten memory beyond that. Winter had come early this year, blanketing his refuge in 3 feet of snow and sealing him in with his canvases, paints, and the persistent whispers of a creativity that refused to materialize. The blizzard that night had been particularly vicious, howling against his windows like a beast demanding entry. Theo sat before his fireplace, nursing a glass of whiskey, when the sound came, not the wind, but something else. A deep, reverberating boom that shook the snow from his roof and sent his dog, Apollo, into a frenzy of barking. "Easy, boy," Theo murmured, reaching for the rifle he kept by the door more out of habit than necessity. "Probably just a tree coming down." Apollo wasn't convinced. The German shepherd pawed frantically at the door, his body trembling with urgency rather than fear. Against his better judgment, Theo pulled on his heavy coat and boots. The moment he cracked the door, Apollo bolted into the storm, becoming a dark shadow against the whirling white. Cursing, Theo followed, the beam of his flashlight cutting weakly through the snowfall. Apollo's barking led him to the edge of the clearing behind his cabin. The snow there had melted in a perfect circle, steam rising from the exposed earth despite the freezing temperature. In the center lay a metallic object, no larger than a compact car, partially buried and twisted like a crushed soda can. And beside it, a figure. "Hello," Theo called, approaching cautiously. "Are you hurt?" The beam of his flashlight illuminated what was clearly not a human being. The creature was humanoid but unmistakably alien, slender with iridescent skin that shifted between deep purple and midnight blue. Where hair should be, delicate tendrils that resembled optical fibers cascaded down her back, glowing faintly with internal light. Most striking were her eyes, large, pupilless, and the color of polished amethyst. She was clearly injured, clutching her side where a viscous silver fluid seeped between her fingers. At the sight of Theo, she shrank back, making a soft, trilling sound that somehow conveyed both fear and pain without any need for translation. "I'm not going to hurt you," Theo said, setting his rifle down in the snow and raising his empty hands. Apollo, surprisingly, had stopped barking and was now whining, nudging his nose against the alien's shoulder. The creature's eyes fluttered, the glow of her fiber-like hair dimming. She was losing consciousness. Every instinct Theo possessed screamed at the insanity of what he was about to do, but he couldn't leave her to die in the snow. He carefully gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than expected, despite being nearly his height, and carried her toward the cabin. Her skin felt like warm silk against his, vibrating with a subtle frequency that made his fingertips tingle. Inside, he laid her on his bed and quickly gathered his first aid supplies. The silver blood had slowed, which he hoped was a good sign. As he cleaned the wound, which appeared to be a gash rather than anything more serious, her eyes opened again, fixing on him with an intensity that made his breath catch. One slender, four-fingered hand reached up to touch his face, leaving a cool trail along his stubbled jaw. The gesture was so unmistakably one of gratitude that Theo felt a lump form in his throat. "You're safe now," he said, knowing she couldn't understand but hopping his tone conveyed the meaning. "I'll help you." As if understanding perfectly, she made a soft, humming sound, her tendrils glowing a little brighter for a moment before she closed her eyes again. Theo sat back, Apollo resting his head on his master's knee, both of them watching their unexpected visitor. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cabin, something had irrevocably changed. The solitude Theo had so carefully cultivated now felt hollow in comparison to the presence of this wounded star traveler who had, quite literally, fallen into his life. 2 weeks after the crash, Theo awoke to find his alien guest standing at his easel, head tilted curiously as she studied his half-finished landscape. Her wound had healed with remarkable speed, leaving only a faint silver line across her ribcage. She wore one of his flannel shirts, comically large on her slender frame, and a pair of sweatpants cinched tight at the waist. "Morning," Theo said, causing her to turn. Those amethyst eyes had become less startling but no less captivating. She pointed to the painting, then to the window where the same mountain view was visible, and made a gesture that somehow conveyed appreciation. "Thanks," Theo said. "Not my best work, though." Over breakfast, she'd taken to human food with cautious enthusiasm, particularly favoring sweet things. Theo continued their now routine language lessons. He pointed to objects, named them, and watched as she repeated the words with increasing accuracy. Cup, he said. Cup, she echoed, her voice melodic with an underlying harmonic that human vocal cords couldn't produce. Spoon. Spoon. By midday, she was stringing together simple sentences, her rate of language acquisition nothing short of miraculous. Theo suspected some form of telepathic or empathic ability might be at work, though she hadn't demonstrated any mind-reading talents. That evening, sitting before the fire, she finally told him her name, a complex sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. When Theo struggled to reproduce it, she placed her hand over his. "You may call me Astrid," she said, using a name she'd heard on the radio broadcast they'd listened to earlier. "Astrid," Theo repeated, "it suits you." She smiled, another human expression she'd adopted, and then her face grew solemn. Using her rapidly expanding vocabulary supplemented with gestures, she began to tell him her story. Her world, millions of light years away, had been invaded by a species she called the Void. They consumed planets, stripping them of resources and leaving lifeless husks. Her people had fought but were overwhelmed. As their final act, they'd sent escape pods with their last survivors to distant galaxies. "I am last," she said, her tendrils dimming to a mournful blue. "All family, gone." Theo felt an ache in his chest as he recognized the desolation in her eyes, the same he'd seen in his own reflection after losing everyone he'd ever loved in a single car accident 3 years ago. "I understand," he said softly. "I'm alone too." Astrid's tendrils brightened slightly as she reached out one four-fingered hand to touch his face. "Not alone now," she said. Theo placed his hand over hers, marveling at how quickly this alien woman had broken through the walls he'd spent years building. In the firelight, with Apollo dozing between them, he felt something shift in his closed-off heart. "I'll continue with parts 2 through 5 of Starfall, When She Claimed My Heart." Part 2, Learning Curve. 2 weeks after the crash, Theo awoke to find his alien guest standing at his easel, head tilted curiously as she studied his half-finished landscape. Her wound had healed with remarkable speed, leaving only a faint silver line across her ribcage. She wore one of his flannel shirts, comically large on her slender frame, and a pair of sweatpants cinched tight at the waist. "Morning," Theo said, causing her to turn. Those amethyst eyes had become less startling but no less captivating. She pointed to the painting, then to the window where the same mountain view was visible, and made a gesture that somehow conveyed appreciation. "Thanks," Theo said. "Not my best work, though." Over breakfast, she'd taken to human food with cautious enthusiasm, particularly favoring sweet things. Theo continued their now routine language lessons. He pointed to objects, named them, and watched as she repeated the words with increasing accuracy. "Cup," he said. "Cup," she echoed, her voice melodic with an underlying harmonic that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "Spoon. Spoon." By midday, she was stringing together simple sentences, her rate of language acquisition nothing short of miraculous. Theo suspected some form of telepathic or empathic ability might be at work, though she hadn't demonstrated any mind-reading talents. That evening, sitting before the fire, she finally told him her name, a complex sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. When Theo struggled to reproduce it, she placed her hand over his. "You may call me Astrid," she said, using a name she'd heard on the radio broadcast they'd listened to earlier. "Astrid," Theo repeated, "it suits you." She smiled, another human expression she'd adopted, and then her face grew solemn. Using her rapidly expanding vocabulary supplemented with gestures, she began to tell him her story. Her world, millions of light years away, had been invaded by a species she called the Void. They consumed planets, stripping them of resources and leaving lifeless husks. Her people had fought but were overwhelmed. As their final act, they'd sent escape pods with their last survivors to distant galaxies. "I am last," she said, her tendrils dimming to a mournful blue. "All family, gone." Theo felt an ache in his chest as he recognized the desolation in her eyes, the same he'd seen in his own reflection after losing everyone he'd ever loved in a single car accident 3 years ago. "I understand," he said softly. "I'm alone too." Astrid's tendrils brightened slightly as she reached out one four-fingered hand to touch his face. "Not alone now," she said. Theo placed his hand over hers, marveling at how quickly this alien woman had broken through the walls he'd spent years building. In the firelight, with Apollo dozing between them, he felt something shift in his closed-off heart. Part 3: Growing Attachment. Spring arrived in the mountains, melting the snow and revealing the first wildflowers. 3 months had passed since Astrid's arrival, and with each day, the line between alien and familiar blurred further. Astrid's command of English had become nearly flawless, though she still occasionally mixed metaphors in endearing ways. More surprising was her artistic talent. She'd begun collaborating with Theo on his paintings, introducing techniques that involved layering pigments to create colors that seemed to shift depending on the angle of viewing, an effect reminiscent of her own skin. Their first collaborative piece sold online for more money than Theo had made in the previous year. "Your world has so much beauty," Astrid said one afternoon as they hiked along a forest trail. Her tendrils, which she now braided to appear more human-like from a distance, rippled with pleasure as she absorbed the scenery. "My home was beautiful too, but in different ways. Our skis were violet, and the plants communicated through light rather than physical contact." Theo watched her face as she spoke, entranced by the way her eyes reflected the sunlight filtering through the trees. She moved with a natural grace that made even the simple act of walking seem like a dance. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Your home?" Astrid was quiet for a moment. "I carry my world within me," she said finally. "But yes, I miss it, however." Her tendrils glowed brighter, a sign Theo had come to recognize as happiness or excitement. "I have found new beauty here with you." The simple statement hung between them, charged with meaning. These moments had been occurring more frequently, lingering glances, accidental touches that neither pulled away from, conversations that stretched into the night as they lay on the cabin roof watching the stars. That evening, Astrid explained more about her species' customs. Physical intimacy, she told him, was considered a spiritual exchange rather than merely physical. Her people bonded for life, sharing memories and emotions through a neural connection established by their tendrils. "It is why I have not pursued what grows between us," she said, her normally melodic voice hesitant. "Such a connection would be permanent for me." Theo sat beside her on the porch swing, the distance between them suddenly charged with new meaning. "And if that's something I wanted too?" he asked, surprised by his own boldness. Astrid's skin shimmed with iridescent patterns, her species equivalent of a blush. "Then we would need to proceed with great care," she said, her hand finding his. "Human and Australian physiology are different, but not, perhaps, incompatible." As twilight deepened around them, Theo leaned forward and, with a gentleness that surprised them both, pressed his lips to hers in a tentative first kiss. The contact sent a shiver of energy through his body, like static electricity but pleasant, warm, and enveloping. Astrid's tendrils glowed bright gold, reaching out instinctively toward him before she controlled the reaction. When they separated, her eyes were filled with wonder. "That was," she whispered. "Just the beginning," Theo finished. The black SUV appeared on the winding mountain road a week later. Theo spotted it from his studio window and felt his stomach drop. He'd been expecting something like this ever since the night of the crash. Whatever had brought Astrid to Earth hadn't gone unnoticed. "Someone's coming," he said, turning to Astrid, who was mixing paints. "Government, probably." Fear flashed across her features, but she remained composed. "The hidden room," she said. They had prepared for this possibility. Behind Theo's bookshelves was a concealed space, originally a cold storage area from the cabin's early days. They'd outfitted it with essentials and an escape route that led to a cave system beyond the property. Once Astrid was safely hidden, Theo greeted the visitors, two men in dark suits who introduced themselves as Department of Energy specialists investigating atmospheric anomalies reported in the area. Their questions were pointed but carefully framed to sound routine. "Mind if we take a look around?" the taller one asked. "Actually, I do," Theo replied, blocking the doorway. "I value my privacy. That's why I live out here. If you want to see more than my front porch, come back with a warrant." The men exchanged glances, but eventually retreated with warnings that they'd return. Theo watched until their vehicle disappeared around the bend before rushing back inside. For 3 days, they remained in a state of high alert. Astrid stayed in the hidden room while Theo made preparations. If the agents returned, they would need to flee, perhaps permanently. On the third night, when it seemed the immediate danger had passed, Theo joined Astrid in the small, hidden space. They sat close, speaking in whispers despite knowing they were alone. "I would not forgive myself if you suffered because of me," Astrid said, her tendrils dimmed to almost complete darkness, a sign of distress. "I chose this," Theo reminded her. "You didn't ask for any of it." In the confined space, with tension still coiling around them, something changed in the air between them. Astrid's tendrils began to emit a soft, pulsing light that matched the rhythm of Theo's heartbeat. "If we must leave tomorrow," she said quietly, "there is something of my people I wish to share with you tonight." What followed was unlike anything Theo could have imagined. Their intimacy transcended physical bodies, beginning with gentle touches that progressed to something deeper. When Astrid's tendrils finally made contact with Theo's temples, a cascade of sensations flooded through him. Memories not his own, emotions both alien and achingly familiar, and a sense of connection so profound it brought tears to his eyes. Their bodies found their own language, different yet harmonious, as her iridescent skin illuminated the darkness around them. The neural connection amplified every sensation, creating feedback loops of pleasure that blurred the boundaries between them. After, as they lay entwined, Astrid explained in a reverent whisper, "Among my people, what we just shared is called the binding. It is rare for it to be possible with another species." Theo traced the patterns still pulsing beneath her skin. "What does it mean?" "It means," she said, her eyes luminous in the dark, "that you are now my family, the only family I have left in this universe." A month passed with no sign of the government agents, though Theo remained vigilant. They had packed emergency bags and established contingency plans, but as days turned to weeks, they cautiously resumed something resembling normal life. One evening, as summer's heat began giving way to the first crisp hints of autumn, Theo found Astrid standing on their porch, gazing at the stars. Since the binding, he occasionally caught echoes of her emotions, another unexpected side effect of their neural connection. "Homesick?" he asked, joining her. She turned, a small smile lifting the corners of her mouth. "Not exactly. I was thinking about the concept of home." In the moonlight, her skin shimmered with subtle patterns that Theo had learned to read as contemplative. She took his hand, guiding it to the center of her chest, where a steady pulse beat beneath his palm. "In my culture, home isn't a place," she explained. "It's a connection. My people believed that souls recognize each other across lifetimes, across galaxies. When we find that recognition, we call it Aelenorith, the eternal return." Theo felt a warmth spreading from his hand through his entire body. "And have you found that here?" "With you," she confirmed. "The binding confirmed what I had begun to suspect from the moment you carried me from the snow. Your soul is familiar to mine, Theo Manning, as if we have found each other before in other lives on other worlds." The concept should have seemed alien, mystical even, but Theo found himself nodding. Something about it resonated with perfect clarity. "I need to show you something," he said, taking her hand and leading her inside. From his desk drawer, he removed a small box he'd been keeping hidden. Inside was a ring, not a traditional diamond, but a band of meteorite iron inlaid with small opals that captured the shifting colors of Astrid's skin. "I've been working with a jeweler in town," he explained. "It's made from a meteorite fragment, a little piece of space that found its way to Earth, like you." Astrid's tendrils glowed with a brilliance he'd never seen before, illuminating the room in soft golden light. "Is this a human bonding ritual?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "It is," Theo confirmed. "Among my people, we call it marriage. It's our way of saying what you've already said to me, that you're my family now." He knelt before her, holding up the ring. "I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know if those men will come back, or if we'll have to run, or if we'll ever find others of your kind. But I do know that whatever comes next, I want to face it with you, as family." Astrid extended her slender hand, 4 fingers spread in acceptance. "In all the vastness of space, across all possible worlds," she whispered as he slipped the ring onto her finger, "I believe I was always falling toward you." Later that night, as they lay beneath the stars on their cabin roof, Astrid began teaching Theo the ancient songs of her people, melodies meant to be carried forward, to ensure that something of her world survived. Theo listened, memorizing each note, understanding that he had become more than her partner. He was now the custodian of an entire civilization's memory, entrusted with keeping it alive through the love they shared. And as Astrid's tendrils gently connected with his mind, sharing visions of her homeworld's beauty, Theo realized they had created something unique in the universe, a family that bridged the stars themselves, proving that even across the vast distances of space, the capacity to find home in another soul remained the most powerful force of all.